History remembers kings. It celebrates conquerors, reformers, and men whose names echo through textbooks and monuments. But beside those names stand figures who shaped nations in quieter ways, figures history chose to forget. In the half-light of the early 17th century, as England and Scotland were bound together under one crown, a queen stood at the heart of power. She wore jewels that dazzled Europe, commanded artists and architects, and reshaped royal culture itself. Yet today, her name rarely stirs recognition. Anne of Denmark was not merely the wife of James I. She was a daughter of kings, a political actor, a fierce mother, and one of the most influential patrons of art England had ever known. She challenged her husband openly, defied court expectations, and used spectacle as a weapon in a world ruled by men. And still, she vanished from memory. Why was her story muted? Why was her power reframed as vanity, her independence dismissed as excess, her voice reduced to whispers in the margins of history? This is not the story of a silent consort. It is the story of a queen who refused to disappear, even as history tried to erase her. This is the story of Anne of Denmark, the forgotten queen of James I. When historians tell the story of the early Stuart era, the spotlight rarely moves far from the king. James I appears as the scholar monarch, the author of divine right, the ruler who united the crowns of England and Scotland. Around him orbit ministers, favorites, and plots. And yet, standing at the very center of this world is a figure strangely absent from the narrative. Anne of Denmark is often reduced to a footnote, a decorative queen, a spender of money, a lover of masks and jewels. For centuries, her presence was dismissed as superficial, her influence written off as inconsequential. Chroniclers shaped by male authority saw culture as frivolous, emotion as weakness, and female power as something unworthy of serious record. But forgetting Anne was not accidental. Her power did not come from battlefields or laws written in ink. It came from image, ceremony, motherhood, and art, from shaping how monarchy itself was seen. She understood that spectacle could speak where words could not, and that influence did not always need permission. This made her dangerous to a historical tradition uncomfortable with women who acted independently of their husbands. Anne challenged James publicly. She fought him over their children. She built her own court, gathered her own allies, and advanced her own vision of queenship. For this, later writers softened her edges, recasting defiance as vanity and strategy as indulgence. Silence followed exaggeration. Criticism turned into neglect. Slowly, Anne faded from the grand story of Britain's transformation, replaced by narratives that felt simpler, safer, and more familiar. Yet history has a habit of revealing what it once concealed. In letters, accounts, performances, and art, Anne's presence still lingers, undeniable, vibrant, and deliberate. To rediscover her is not to add a minor character back into the story, but to realize that something essential has been missing all along. Anne of Denmark was not forgotten because she was unimportant. She was forgotten because she mattered. Anne of Denmark was born into a world where power was inherited, negotiated, and defended from the moment a child first drew breath. She entered that world on December 12, 1574, at Skanderborg Castle, a stronghold of the Danish crown, surrounded by snow, stone, and ceremony. She was the daughter of King Frederick II of Denmark and Norway and Queen Sophie of Mecklenburg-Güstrow, rulers who stood at the crossroads of Northern Europe's shifting alliances. From birth, Anne was more than a princess. She was a political asset, a future queen shaped by dynastic ambition. The blood that ran through her veins connected her to some of the most powerful royal houses in Europe. Her family ruled seas and trade routes, commanded armies, and balanced carefully between Protestant reform and Old Catholic power. This was a court that understood influence not only through force, but through marriage, image, and diplomacy. Anne's early years unfolded in a kingdom confident in its authority. Denmark was wealthy, strategically vital, and culturally vibrant. Her father, Frederick II of Denmark and Norway, was a formidable ruler, boisterous, commanding, and deeply invested in strengthening the monarchy. Her mother, Sophie, was intelligent and financially astute, quietly managing estates and resources with precision. From them, Anne inherited both spectacle and control. Even as a child, Anne was watched closely. Every gesture, every tutor, every lesson carried meaning. She was raised not simply to obey, but to represent. Her body, her voice, and her future already claimed by the expectations of kings. In this environment, Anne learned early that crowns were not symbols. They were burdens passed from one generation to the next. And one day, she would be expected to carry that weight far from home into a kingdom not her own. Anne's childhood unfolded within the ordered grandeur of the Danish royal court, a place where ritual shaped daily life and hierarchy was learned before it was questioned. The court moved between castles, Skanderborg, Kronborg, Copenhagen, each stone corridor reinforcing the permanence of monarchy and the distance between ruler and subject. For a young princess, this was both home and training ground. From an early age, Anne was surrounded by ceremony. Meals were formal affairs, clothing followed strict codes, and even play was watched with careful eyes. She learned how to enter a room, how to sit, how to speak, and when to remain silent. These were not trivial lessons. In royal courts, behavior was power made visible. Anne's upbringing was deeply shaped by her mother, Queen Sophie, who ensured her children were disciplined, educated, and prepared for political life. Sophie's influence instilled in Anne a sense of order and self-possession. At the same time, the Danish court was less rigid than those of southern Europe, allowing Anne a measure of independence that would later define her character. Religion framed every aspect of her childhood. Raised firmly Lutheran, Anne absorbed the values of Protestant Northern Europe, piety, restraint, and moral duty, while also witnessing the tensions religion created across borders. She learned early that faith was not only personal, but political. Music echoed through palace halls. Artists, scholars, and diplomats passed constantly through court, exposing Anne to ideas beyond Denmark's shores. Languages, stories, and customs from across Europe filtered into her world, quietly shaping her curiosity and imagination. Yet beneath the refinement lay constant awareness of her purpose. Anne was not raised to rule Denmark, she was raised to leave it. Every lesson carried the unspoken truth that her future lay elsewhere, bound by marriage to a foreign king. In the Danish court, Anne learned how to endure observation, how to command attention, and how to perform authority. These skills, honed in childhood, would later allow her to survive and challenge the unforgiving courts of Scotland and England. Anne of Denmark's education was designed with precision, shaped by the knowledge that a princess's mind could be as politically valuable as her bloodline. From childhood, her tutors understood that she was being prepared not merely for marriage, but for life inside a foreign court, where intellect, composure, and adaptability could determine survival. Anne was taught multiple languages, including German and French, the diplomatist tongues of Europe. Through language came access to negotiation, to correspondence, to influence beyond borders. She learned to read and write with confidence, an education still denied to many women of her era, and was encouraged to engage with religious and moral texts that reinforced both piety and discipline. Music and dance played a central role in her training. These were not idle accomplishments. In royal courts, performance was communication. Anne learned how movement, rhythm, and presentation could project harmony, authority, and refinement. Years later, these lessons would evolve into her mastery of court masks, where art became political expression. History and genealogy were carefully studied. Anne was taught to recognize coats of arms, royal lineages, and the delicate web of alliances that connected Europe's ruling families. She learned where she stood in that hierarchy and how fragile such positions could be. Equally important was her education in etiquette and self-control. Anne was trained to mask emotion, to endure scrutiny, and to respond to provocation with calculated restraint. Silence, she learned, could be as powerful as speech. Yet her education was not designed to foster obedience alone. Anne absorbed examples of strong female authority through her mother and other noblewomen, learning that queens could influence policy, culture, and succession, even when barred from formal power. By the time Anne reached adolescence, she was already prepared for a role that demanded intelligence, adaptability, and quiet resilience. Her education did not teach her how to rule, but it taught her how to matter.
In late 16th century Europe, marriage was never a private affair. It was strategy, it was leverage, it was the slow, deliberate movement of pieces across a vast political chessboard, where kingdoms rose or fell not only by war, but by weddings. As Anne of Denmark entered adolescence, her value increased with every passing year. She was Protestant, royal, well-educated, and connected to a powerful northern kingdom that controlled vital sea routes. To Europe's rulers, she was not simply a young woman, she was an alliance waiting to be claimed. Envoys began to whisper her name in distant courts. Proposals were discussed, weighed, and discarded. Each potential match carried risks, religious tension, territorial ambition, shifting loyalties. A wrong marriage could provoke war. A clever one could secure decades of peace. Denmark itself played carefully. King Frederick II understood that Anne's marriage could strengthen Denmark's influence far beyond its borders. The question was not whether Anne would marry, but where her loyalty would be placed when she did. Once chosen, there would be no return. Across the North Sea, Scotland watched closely. James VI, a young king ruling an unstable realm, needed legitimacy, money, and international recognition. A Danish bride offered all three. She would bring prestige, a valuable dowry, and a Protestant alliance that reassured nervous nobles. Negotiations moved slowly, deliberately. Letters crossed oceans. Terms were argued over: religion, ceremony, finances, succession. Anne herself had little formal say, yet she was keenly aware that her future was being decided in rooms she would never enter. This was the paradox of royal marriage. Anne was central to the negotiations, yet absent from them. Her life, her body, her loyalty were treated as instruments of statecraft. The board was nearly set. One final move remained, binding a Scottish king and a Danish princess together, not for love, but for the balance of Europe itself. The match between Anne of Denmark and James VI of Scotland was not born of romance, but of necessity. James was a king surrounded by uncertainty, financially strained, politically fragile, and ruling a kingdom long divided by faction and faith. By the late 1580s, his need for a strong, respectable marriage had become urgent.
Scotland required stability, James required legitimacy, and Europe was watching. Anne offered answers to problems James could not solve alone. She was Protestant, easing fears of Catholic influence in Scotland. She came from a wealthy and respected royal house, promising a generous dowry that could steady the Scottish crown's finances. Most importantly, she represented international recognition, proof that Scotland belonged among Europe's serious powers. For Denmark, the match was equally calculated. Aligning with Scotland strengthened Protestant unity in the north and extended Danish influence across the North Sea. Anne would serve as Denmark's living ambassador in a foreign court, her presence binding two kingdoms through blood rather than treaty. Negotiations were meticulous. Every detail was examined. Anne's religion, her household, her future children, and the financial terms of the marriage. Even the language of the contract was carefully chosen, as if words alone could control the future. James, cautious and deeply intellectual, reviewed portraits of Anne, flat images meant to represent a woman he had never met. Anne, meanwhile, prepared for a destiny decided far beyond her voice. She knew James only through reports, scholarly, cautious, unpredictable. She understood that marriage to him meant exile from her homeland and immersion in a court known for suspicion and intrigue. In 1589, the agreement was finalized. The marriage would take place by proxy, a symbolic union performed without the groom present. It was a striking reminder that this bond was political first, personal second. Two strangers were now bound together by ink and expectation. What remained was the crossing of a sea and the collision of two very different worlds. In August 1589, Anne of Denmark became a married woman without her husband at her side. The ceremony took place in Copenhagen, solemn and formal, watched by diplomats, nobles, and courtiers who understood its significance. At Anne's side stood not a king, but a proxy, George Keith, the Earl Marischal of Scotland, acting in James VI's place. With ritual words and symbolic gestures, a marriage was declared that joined two crowns across the sea. The absence of James was more than symbolic. It revealed the nature of the union itself. This was not a personal bond forged by shared vows and glances, but a political contract enacted through representation. For Anne, it marked a moment of profound transition. In the eyes of Europe, she was now Queen of Scotland, yet she had never set foot on Scottish soil, nor spoken directly with her husband. Tradition demanded composure. Anne performed her role flawlessly, outwardly calm beneath the weight of expectation. She accepted the ring, the ceremony, and the applause of the court, knowing that her life had irrevocably changed in a single afternoon. From that moment forward, her loyalty belonged not to Denmark, but to a distant kingdom she knew only through stories and treaties. The absence of James was more than symbolic. It revealed the nature of the union itself. This was not a personal bond forged by shared vows and glances, but a political contract enacted through representation. For Anne, it marked a moment of profound transition. In the eyes of Europe, she was now Queen of Scotland, yet she had never set foot on Scottish soil, nor spoken directly with her husband. Tradition demanded composure. Anne performed her role flawlessly, outwardly calm beneath the weight of expectation. She accepted the ring, the ceremony, and the applause of the court, knowing that her life had irrevocably changed in a single afternoon. From that moment forward, her loyalty belonged not to Denmark, but to a distant kingdom she knew only through stories and treaties. The marriage by proxy was meant to be temporary, a prelude to her journey west. Ships were prepared, her household assembled, and farewells carefully staged. Yet uncertainty lingered. The North Sea was treacherous, especially as autumn approached, and Anne's voyage would be no simple crossing. Behind the ceremony lay quiet anxiety. Anne was leaving behind family, language, and certainty. Ahead waited a foreign king, a suspicious court, and a life defined by expectation rather than choice. Her crown was now real, but so was the distance between her and the man she was bound to call husband.
In the autumn of 1589, Anne of Denmark set sail for Scotland, carrying more than trunks of clothing and royal plate. She carried the weight of two kingdoms' expectations, bound for a land she had never seen and a husband she had never met. The North Sea stretched before her, unpredictable, violent, and indifferent to crowns. From the beginning, the journey was cursed by bad weather. Storms battered the fleet, winds tearing at sails and driving the ships off course. Waves rose like walls, crashing against the hulls with relentless force. For days the fleet struggled to maintain formation as sailors fought the sea and prayed for survival. What should have been a triumphant voyage became a trial of endurance. Anne's ship was forced to turn back, seeking refuge along the coast of Norway. The delay was humiliating and frightening. Rumors spread quickly, whispers of witchcraft, of divine disapproval, of unseen enemies working against the Queen's passage. In an age where superstition and politics intertwined, even the weather carried meaning. Confined to unfamiliar ports, Anne waited as weeks passed. Supplies dwindled, tempers frayed, and anxiety deepened. Each delay threatened her reputation and her safety. To arrive late, or not at all, could be interpreted as weakness, or worse, an omen for the marriage itself. Yet Anne endured. She did not retreat to Denmark, though she easily could have. Instead, she remained determined to complete the journey, refusing to let fear or misfortune define her first act as queen. Her resolve impressed observers and unsettled critics who expected fragility. Unbeknownst to her, the chaos of the voyage would soon provoke an extraordinary response. The storms that held her captive at sea would push her husband to defy tradition and to cross the waters himself. The sea had delayed a queen. It would now summon a king. When news reached James VII that Anne's voyage had been delayed by storms, he faced a decision few kings would dare. He would go to her. In September 1589, James made the extraordinary choice to sail across the North Sea himself, abandoning convention, protocol, and the comfort of his Scottish port. For a king, such a journey was dangerous, unseemly, and deeply symbolic. Yet James's resolve was clear. His bride would not wait indefinitely for a stranger's arrival. James's voyage was fraught with risk. Autumn seas were notorious for sudden storms, hidden shoals, and treacherous currents. Sailors whispered their fears as the king's ship cut through dark waters, a vessel carrying not only a monarch but the fragile reputation of his realm. Every swell tested the crew's skill, every gust of wind tested the king's determination. In taking the journey himself, James exposed both his courage and his vulnerability. For Anne, still stranded in Norway, the news of James's impending arrival was astonishing. She had been alone for weeks, navigating uncertainty and fear. To learn that her husband, the king she had yet to meet, would cross the storm-tossed sea in person was both a relief and a surprise. It was a gesture that shattered expectations of royal decorum, signaling not just authority, but personal investment.
When James arrived, the meeting was charged with a mixture of tension, relief, and fascination. The young queen, wary but dignified, and the king, determined yet untested, came together on foreign shores. The stormy voyage had become more than a passage of water. It was a crucible that transformed their union from a political contract into a personal encounter. In that moment, James's boldness and Anne's endurance set the stage for a marriage that would shape kingdoms, test loyalties, and leave a mark on history far beyond the North Sea.
The long-anticipated moment finally arrived. Anne of Denmark and James VI were to meet in person. After weeks of stormy seas, delays, and uncertainty, the two monarchs, bound by duty, expectation, and political necessity, stood face to face for the first time on the shores of Norway. The air was crisp with autumn chill, the port bustling with courtiers, sailors, and attendants, all aware that history itself seemed to pause in that instant. Anne, poised and regal despite weeks of confinement and anxiety, carried the weight of her new role with quiet authority. She had been married by proxy, yet this was the first time she could see her husband, the king whose presence would now shape her life entirely. Her nerves were tempered by the training of her Danish upbringing. The lessons of diplomacy, self-control, and performance were ingrained, preparing her to meet James not as a naive bride, but as a sovereign in her own right. James, equally aware of the symbolic gravity of the encounter, approached with both curiosity and caution. This was a man accustomed to power, yet he too faced the uncertainties of a marriage arranged by others in a world he barely knew. The king's careful composure concealed both excitement and strategic calculation. The eyes of Scotland, Denmark, and Europe were upon him. When they finally greeted each other, it was a mixture of ceremony and intimacy. Courtiers held their breath as bows were exchanged, words carefully chosen, and hands clasped. In that moment, two very different worlds, Danish and Scottish, female and male authority, tradition and ambition, converged. This first meeting was more than a personal introduction. It was a test of character, patience, and resolve, setting the tone for a marriage that would endure trials, triumphs, and tragedies. Anne and James's union had moved from paper to flesh. History was about to witness the beginning of their extraordinary, often difficult partnership.
The wedding of Anne of Denmark and James VI took place in the icy grip of a Scandinavian winter, a ceremony both grand and fraught with discomfort. Snow blanketed the Danish countryside, transforming the castle into a picture of crystalline beauty. Yet beneath the surface, the chill seeped into bones, garments, and nerves alike. Courtiers moved carefully along frozen courtyards, their fur-lined cloaks brushing against walls of stone. Candles flickered in drafty halls, casting shadows that danced across tapestries depicting past monarchs, a reminder of the lineage Anne was now joining. Anne, radiant in her ceremonial gown, embodied the expectations of royalty. Every detail of her appearance, from jeweled headpiece to embroidered sleeves, was designed to signal wealth, dignity, and authority. Yet beneath her poise lay a quiet anxiety. She was leaving Denmark, stepping into a new kingdom, and marrying a king she barely knew. The cold was not only physical, it echoed the uncertainty of her future. James VI, dressed in dark, regal finery, waited at the altar, his presence both reassuring and formal. The ceremony, conducted with meticulous ritual, blended political symbolism and personal obligation. Vows were exchanged, witnesses observed in hushed reverence, and the union, though arranged for statecraft, began to take its human form.
The wedding was celebrated with music, feasting, and pageantry that temporarily masked the difficulties ahead. Courtiers marveled at Anne's elegance, yet some whispered doubts about how the young Danish princess would adapt to Scottish life. For Anne and James, the ceremony marked both a beginning and a test. It was a public affirmation of duty, yet private uncertainties lingered. This winter wedding, set against snow and stone, heralded the start of a partnership that would define a dynasty and reveal the complexities of power, love, and loyalty in the early modern monarchy.
After weeks of delays, storms, and negotiations, Anne of Denmark finally began her journey to Scotland, leaving behind the familiar castles and courts of her homeland. She traveled with a carefully organized retinue, including ladies-in-waiting, servants, and guards, each tasked with attending to her every need while projecting the dignity expected of a queen. Yet despite the preparations, the journey was fraught with both physical and emotional challenges. The North Sea, unpredictable and treacherous in autumn, tested every sailor's skill. Waves lashed against the hulls, winds tore at the sails, and ice-cold spray stung Anne's face. Even for the most seasoned crew, navigating these waters demanded vigilance, courage, and endurance. For Anne, the voyage was not merely a passage across water, it was a rite of passage into a life she had yet to know. She faced the uncertainty of a foreign kingdom, a husband she had barely met, and the expectations of two courts watching her every move. Along the way, Anne endured long hours confined to cramped cabins, the monotony broken only by brief moments on deck when the cold wind and spray reminded her of the distance she had traveled from home. She wrote letters to her family, expressing both apprehension and determination, seeking comfort in familiar words while preparing herself for the unknown. Her journey was observed closely by diplomats and envoys. Every decision, every glance carried political significance. Anne was aware that her arrival would symbolize not only a marriage, but a union of kingdoms, a delicate negotiation of power between Denmark and Scotland. By the time she sighted the Scottish coast, Anne had already begun to prove herself resilient, composed, and determined. The journey itself had tested her, shaping the queen who would now step into a new realm, ready to navigate court intrigue, political tension, and the challenges of married royalty. Anne of Denmark's arrival in Scotland was followed swiftly by one of the most important events of her life, her coronation as Queen of Scots. The ceremony took place in Holyrood Abbey, a building steeped in history and symbolism, where kings and queens had been crowned for generations. The abbey's stone walls, worn smooth by centuries of ritual, reflected both the continuity of the Scottish monarchy and the weight of expectation now resting on Anne's shoulders. On the day of the coronation, Anne wore a gown of gold and crimson, her head crowned with a circlet encrusted with jewels that sparkled in the cold morning light. Every detail, from her embroidered sleeves to the delicate lace around her neck, was chosen to convey authority, wealth, and dignity. She processed through the abbey with a retinue of ladies and officials, each step measured, each gesture symbolic. Courtiers, nobles, and clergy watched intently, knowing that this ceremony was as much about politics as it was about pageantry. The rituals of coronation were carefully observed. Anne took oaths of loyalty to the Scottish people and the crown, while clergy blessed her in accordance with the Protestant faith. She accepted the scepter and orb, symbols of power and responsibility,
Understanding that her role would extend beyond being a consort, she was now a public figure whose influence could shape culture, politics, and dynastic succession. Yet the coronation also underscored her isolation. Scotland was a foreign land, its court wary and factionalized. Anne had supporters, but many viewed her with suspicion, uncertain how a Danish princess would fit into their kingdom. The ceremony marked her triumph, but also the beginning of a life that demanded diplomacy, resilience, and political acumen. By the day's end, Anne had become more than a bride or a queen by proxy. She was the recognized Queen of Scots, stepping into a role that required courage, tact, and vision to navigate a complex and often unforgiving court.
Life at the Scottish court proved far more challenging than Anne of Denmark had anticipated. Though she had been crowned Queen of Scots, the court was rife with factionalism, suspicion, and subtle hostility toward a foreign queen. Her arrival disrupted long-standing alliances, and her presence became a lightning rod for nobles who feared losing influence or who resented the imposition of a Danish princess on Scottish affairs. Anne faced cultural and linguistic barriers. Danish customs, manners, and court etiquette differed from Scottish expectations, and courtiers often whispered about her unfamiliar ways. She spoke some English and German, but struggled with Scots, creating distance between herself and those whose approval she needed to secure. Small misunderstandings could quickly escalate, and Anne learned that even minor gestures were scrutinized for signs of disrespect or ambition. Her marriage to James offered no immediate refuge. Though they had met in Norway, the young couple's bond remained distant and formal. James, preoccupied with politics and the pressures of kingship, left Anne to navigate a court where every word, gesture, and appearance carried political weight. She quickly realized that survival required careful diplomacy, strategic alliances, and patience. At the same time, Anne sought to assert her authority and protect her household. She advocated for her ladies-in-waiting, managed her finances, and began to exert influence in cultural affairs, commissioning music, art, and court entertainments. Yet every action could be questioned or interpreted as overstepping, and courtiers were quick to label independence as pride or insolence. Anne's struggles at the Scottish court tested her resilience. She learned to balance deference with self-assertion, navigating intrigue while cultivating her own sphere of influence. These early challenges shaped her into a queen who understood that power was as much about perception and ceremony as it was about law or lineage, and that a foreign queen would always need to fight to be respected.
Anne of Denmark's role as a mother quickly became intertwined with politics, revealing both her determination and her willingness to challenge even a king. The birth of her first son, Henry Frederick, in 1594 should have been a moment of joy and celebration. Instead, it became the center of a tense struggle between Anne and James VI over custody, influence, and the future of the Scottish throne. From the moment of Henry's birth, James sought to assert control, insisting that the child be raised under his supervision. To him, this was a matter of ensuring loyalty and shaping the heir according to his vision of kingship. Anne, however, was unwilling to relinquish her maternal authority so easily. She saw her son not merely as a future monarch, but as her child, deserving of her guidance, protection, and affection. The battle was fought in both private and public arenas. Letters, petitions, and interventions from courtiers and foreign allies became instruments in a delicate negotiation. Anne leveraged her intelligence, her network of supporters, and her understanding of Scottish politics to assert her rights as mother and queen.
She reminded James and the court that her influence over Henry's upbringing was not frivolous, but vital to the dynasty's future. Tensions escalated, creating moments of deep conflict within the royal household. Courtiers whispered, factions formed, and the king and queen's relationship became increasingly strained. Yet Anne's persistence paid off. She secured a compromise that allowed her to remain intimately involved in her son's early life. This struggle marked more than a mother's defense of her child. It revealed Anne's courage, political acumen, and willingness to challenge male authority in a patriarchal world. In fighting for Henry, she demonstrated that queenship was not passive. It was active, strategic, and fiercely protective, qualities that would define her role at court for decades to come. Anne of Denmark's determination to protect her children became one of the defining features of her queenship. Her maternal instincts, combined with political acumen, often placed her in direct opposition to her husband, James VI. After the birth of her first son, Henry Frederick, tensions over custody and influence intensified, and Anne refused to remain a passive observer of her child's upbringing. She recognized that motherhood was not separate from monarchy. Her son's education, values, and alliances would shape the future of Scotland and eventually England. Anne insisted on her right to oversee his early years, challenging James when he attempted to control every aspect of the prince's life. This defiance was not born of rebellion alone, it was strategic. Anne understood that her position at court was fragile, and that asserting authority in matters of family could secure her influence more broadly. Her methods were deliberate. Anne employed courtiers, family connections, and correspondence with European allies to bolster her position. She negotiated fiercely, using every tool available to protect her maternal prerogatives. In private, she would plead with James, appealing to reason and shared interest. In public, she projected dignity, signaling to the court that she was not to be underestimated. The Queen's defiance drew both admiration and criticism. Some courtiers feared her independence, interpreting it as ambition or arrogance. Others admired her courage, seeing a mother willing to challenge even a king for the sake of her child. Through this struggle, Anne established a precedent. Her voice mattered, even in the male-dominated sphere of the Scottish court. She demonstrated that queenship was active, engaged, and deeply intertwined with motherhood. Anne's defiance was not merely personal, it was political, setting the stage for a reign defined by resilience, influence, and the assertion of her own authority in the face of patriarchal expectation. After weeks of tense negotiation and subtle maneuvering, Anne of Denmark finally secured a measure of victory in the struggle over her son, Prince Henry. Her insistence on remaining involved in his upbringing had been met with resistance from James VI, whose desire to control every aspect of the heir's education clashed with Anne's determination to protect her maternal influence. Yet through persistence, strategy, and careful diplomacy, she carved out her place as a mother with authority, a rare achievement in a court dominated by men. The moment of triumph, however, was bittersweet. Anne had won her rights, but the conflict revealed the fragile foundation of her marriage. The joy of victory was tinged with the knowledge that her relationship with James was marked by tension and suspicion. Their union, arranged for political convenience, now carried the weight of personal and ideological disagreements, exposing the limits of royal harmony. Anne's victory also underscored the challenges of being a foreign queen in Scotland. While she had succeeded in asserting her authority over her child, the court remained wary of her influence. Every ally gained, every compromise achieved, was balanced by whispers of discontent and subtle resentment. The Queen understood that power was rarely absolute. Even a hard-won triumph could carry unforeseen consequences. Despite these challenges, Anne's resolve remained unshaken. She had demonstrated her capacity to act decisively, to protect her family, and to navigate the intricate politics of a hostile court. Her victory over James in this personal struggle strengthened her reputation as a queen who would not be silenced or sidelined, even by a king. Yet the bitterness of compromise lingered, a reminder that authority often comes at a personal cost, and that the life of a queen is rarely free of conflict, even in moments of triumph. By the late 1590s, Anne of Denmark's position at the Scottish court had grown increasingly complex. Her influence, once limited to ceremonial presence and motherhood, now extended into cultural, political, and domestic spheres. Yet with influence came friction, and the court had become a divided arena, split between factions loyal to James VI and those sympathetic to the Queen. Anne's assertiveness, particularly in matters concerning her household and children, was met with suspicion. Courtiers whispered about her ambitions, interpreting her actions as challenges to royal authority rather than expressions of legitimate concern. Her foreign origin, her Danish upbringing, and her independent nature set her apart in a court that prized tradition and conformity. Every public appearance, every act of patronage became a subtle negotiation, a test of loyalty, and a reminder that power at court was never static. The divisions were not solely political. Personal rivalries and mistrust created a climate of tension. Anne's ladies-in-waiting, carefully selected from Denmark and aligned with her interests, were sometimes targets of resentment, while Scottish nobles sought to assert influence over the Queen and her household. These small, seemingly minor contests of control reflected the broader struggle between two powerful figures, a king determined to maintain authority and a queen determined to protect her prerogatives. Amid the courtly divisions, Anne found ways to assert herself subtly. She hosted masques, commissioned music, and cultivated networks of influence that extended beyond formal politics. Through these acts, she projected authority without overt confrontation, shaping court culture while navigating factional rivalries. The court split revealed both the vulnerability and the strength of a foreign queen in Scotland. Anne's experience demonstrated that queenship was as much about negotiation and perception as it was about lineage or ceremony. In a divided court, she learned that survival depended on tact, intelligence, and unwavering resolve, qualities that would define her reign and legacy.
Anne of Denmark quickly became more than a political figure. She emerged as a cultural force, using art, fashion, and spectacle to shape her image and assert influence at court. In a time when queens were often confined to domestic roles, Anne understood that patronage could be a powerful form of authority. Through commissioning paintings, supporting musicians, and sponsoring elaborate masques, she transformed the Scottish and later English courts into stages for her vision of royalty. Her taste was sophisticated and deliberate. Portraits of Anne were meticulously designed to convey elegance, refinement, and sovereignty. Every garment, jewel, and hairstyle was carefully chosen to communicate status and intention, blending personal expression with political messaging. Artists and craftsmen were commissioned not merely to produce beauty, but to embody the Queen's authority, projecting her influence across the kingdom. Music and theatre were central to her patronage. Anne encouraged composers and performers, turning the court into a hub of innovation. Masques, in particular, became a medium through which she could blend artistic expression with political commentary.
By participating in these performances, Anne demonstrated her presence and power while captivating nobles and foreign visitors alike. These spectacles showcased her intelligence, taste, and ability to orchestrate events that reinforced her status as queen. Anne's commitment to art and beauty was also a form of diplomacy. Gifts of paintings, jewels, and commissioned works were exchanged with foreign courts, signaling both wealth and refinement. Her influence extended beyond aesthetics. She shaped the court's cultural identity, elevated artists, and created an environment in which her authority could flourish subtly but unmistakably. Through patronage, Anne of Denmark asserted herself as a queen who wielded culture as power. In a world dominated by men, her artistic vision became a tool of influence, a mark of her sophistication, and a lasting contribution to the history of European courts.
Anne of Denmark played a pivotal role in the creation and popularization of the court masque, a form of theatrical spectacle that blended music, dance, poetry, and elaborate costumes. Unlike ordinary entertainment, the masque was a carefully constructed performance designed to celebrate monarchy, assert cultural sophistication, and subtly convey political messages. For Anne, it became both an artistic passion and a tool of influence. The early masques at her Scottish and later English courts were lavish affairs, staged in palaces filled with tapestries, candlelight, and painted backdrops. Anne collaborated closely with writers, composers, and designers, ensuring that every detail, from choreography to costume to scenery, reflected her vision. These performances were more than shows, they were statements. Through masks, Anne communicated ideals of harmony, order, and royal authority, while also asserting her presence in a male-dominated court. Participation in the masque was another innovation. Unlike most queens, Anne often performed alongside her courtiers, embodying allegorical figures, mythological heroines, or symbolic representations of virtue and power. Her involvement astonished and captivated audiences, demonstrating that she was not a passive consort, but an active, intelligent participant in courtly life. This visibility allowed Anne to influence opinion, charm allies, and subtly assert authority over cultural and political narratives. The masque also reflected Anne's understanding of spectacle as diplomacy. Visiting dignitaries and ambassadors witnessed performances designed to impress, reinforce alliances, and project the sophistication of her court. By intertwining artistry and politics, Anne elevated what might have been frivolous entertainment into a strategic instrument of influence. Through the birth of the court masque, Anne of Denmark transformed royal performance into a language of power. She showed that art could be authority, that beauty could convey strategy, and that a queen, even in a patriarchal society, could command attention and respect through creativity, intelligence, and vision. Anne of Denmark's presence on the stage of the court was unprecedented for a queen in her time. Unlike most royal women who observed from the sidelines, she stepped into the spotlight, performing in elaborate masques alongside courtiers and professional artists. These performances were more than entertainment, they were political theater, a way for Anne to assert her influence, display her intelligence, and shape public perception. In the dimly lit halls of the palace, Anne transformed into allegorical figures, goddesses, or embodiments of virtue and beauty. Her costumes were rich with symbolism. Flowing silks, embroidered with gold and jewels, projected power, refinement, and sophistication. Every movement, every gesture was carefully choreographed to convey grace and authority. Through these performances, Anne demonstrated that a queen could be both sovereign and participant, bridging the gap between spectacle and statecraft.
Audiences were captivated. Courtiers whispered in admiration, foreign ambassadors noted her elegance in reports, and poets immortalized her performances in verse. Anne's stagecraft left a lasting legacy. By embodying both performer and patron, she transformed the mask into a platform for political and cultural expression. Her courage to appear publicly, to take center stage, and to command attention in a patriarchal court redefined queenship, leaving a model for influence, artistry, and authority that would echo through European courts for generations. Anne of Denmark's bold presence at court and her public performances in masks soon sparked controversy. In a society where women, even queens, were expected to remain passive and deferential, her active participation in politics, culture, and public spectacle drew sharp criticism. Courtiers, writers, and some clergy questioned her behavior, portraying independence as arrogance and artistic expression as vanity. Anne's performances in masks were particularly contentious. Critics argued that a queen should not appear on stage, interpreting her public visibility as a breach of propriety. Some whispered that her involvement in theater and music undermined the dignity of the monarchy, framing her creativity as frivolous or even morally suspect. Yet Anne understood that spectacle was power. Each mask, each carefully staged entrance communicated authority, intellect, and taste, subtle signals that she would not be sidelined in a male-dominated court. Religious tensions amplified criticism. As a foreign Protestant queen in a time of shifting religious allegiances, Anne was often suspected of secret Catholic sympathies. Her patronage of certain artists and her lavish court entertainments were viewed with suspicion by Puritan critics, who considered such extravagance sinful. Even small gestures, jewels, costumes, or poetry could be politicized and weaponized against her, demonstrating the precarious position of a queen whose influence extended beyond ceremonial duties. Despite these attacks, Anne remained resolute. She used criticism to refine her strategies, balancing visibility with diplomacy, spectacle with control. By continuing to support artists, commission masks, and assert her tastes, she demonstrated that controversy could be a tool rather than a hindrance. Through controversy and criticism, Anne of Denmark defined a new model of queenship, one in which cultural influence, intelligence, and personal agency were inseparable from political power, leaving a legacy that challenged the limitations imposed on royal women for centuries. Anne of Denmark understood that fashion was far more than personal adornment. It was a language of authority and influence. Every gown, jewel, and accessory she wore was carefully chosen to communicate her status, taste, and political intentions. In the courts of Scotland and later England, appearances were scrutinized, and Anne mastered the art of projecting power through style. Her wardrobe was extravagant yet deliberate. Rich silks embroidered with gold and silver threads adorned her figure, signaling wealth, refinement, and sovereign dignity. Pearls and gemstones were not mere decoration, they were symbols of lineage, virtue, and political alliances. Anne's clothing communicated messages both subtle and overt. A carefully selected color could signify loyalty. A patterned design could reference dynastic heritage, and the scale of her jewelry could display authority over her household and court. Fashion also became a means of influence. Anne set trends that nobles and courtiers emulated, turning style into a subtle form of power. Her taste shaped courtly culture, influencing both aesthetic values and social hierarchy. Attendants and ladies-in-waiting were expected to mirror her elegance, reinforcing her authority through visual cohesion. by controlling the presentation of herself and her court, Anne created an environment in which her influence extended far beyond speeches or decrees. Even in public ceremonies, appearances were political. Coronations, masks, and diplomatic meetings were stages for visual messaging, where fashion conveyed refinement, sophistication, and command. Critics might dismiss her choices as vanity, but Anne understood the strategic impact of perception. Through fashion, Anne of Denmark demonstrated that queenship encompassed both substance and spectacle. Her mastery of style was a form of agency, enabling her to assert authority, shape courtly culture, and leave a lasting impression on subjects and ambassadors alike. In a world dominated by men, she turned appearance into an unmistakable instrument of power. Religion was never merely personal for Anne of Denmark, it was deeply political. In a Scotland and later England fraught with religious tension, her faith and practices were constantly scrutinized. Born and raised Lutheran, Anne found herself in courts dominated by Presbyterian or Anglican authority, where her foreign upbringing made every gesture, prayer, and preference a potential cause for suspicion. Anne's private devotion often became public controversy. She maintained chaplains and attended religious services that reflected her beliefs, yet critics quickly framed these choices as political statements. Rumors circulated that she favored Catholic sympathies, a dangerous accusation in Protestant Scotland and England, where faith was inseparable from loyalty. Even small deviations from local customs were magnified, creating an atmosphere of distrust around the Queen. Her religious practices intersected with political intrigue. Courtiers and factions interpreted Anne's preferences as aligning with one side or another in ongoing power struggles, using her faith to challenge her influence or question her loyalty. Diplomatic envoys also scrutinized her observances, aware that the Queen's religion could impact alliances and the perception of the monarchy abroad. Despite this scrutiny, Anne navigated religious suspicion with intelligence and tact. She balanced personal devotion with political necessity, ensuring that her faith remained her own while minimizing overt conflicts with the dominant church. At times, she strategically deferred. At other moments, she asserted her right to private worship, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of the delicate intersection between spirituality and sovereignty. Religion and suspicion shaped Anne's queenship profoundly. Her ability to maintain personal belief while managing public perception highlighted her political acumen, patience, and resilience. In a court where faith could be weaponized, Anne proved that a queen's religious identity could be both private devotion and subtle instrument of influence, reinforcing her authority even under constant scrutiny. In 1603, the death of Elizabeth I ended the Tudor dynasty and opened the door for James VI of Scotland to ascend the English throne as James I. For Anne of Denmark, this moment marked a profound transformation. No longer Queen of Scotland alone, she was now poised to become Queen Consort of England, a kingdom larger, wealthier, and far more politically complex. The journey from Scotland to England was both literal and symbolic. Anne accompanied James on the royal progress south, traveling through lands that were politically unfamiliar and culturally distinct. The Scottish Queen stepped into a world steeped in English tradition, with courtiers, nobles, and officials whose expectations and loyalties often conflicted with her own. Every step of the journey required tact, diplomacy, and an acute awareness of public perception. Anne's presence alongside James signaled continuity and legitimacy to the English people, while asserting her role as partner in monarchy. Her arrival in England, however, was not without challenges. Elizabeth's long reign had left a legacy of suspicion toward foreign influence, and Anne, as a Danish princess, faced immediate scrutiny. Courtiers debated her appearance, her habits, and her entourage. Some saw her as an exotic distraction, others as a political asset to be courted or undermined. Anne understood that her visibility, style, and comportment would communicate power as much as her husband's decisions. Anne's elevation to the English throne also expanded her opportunities for influence. She could now patronize artists, musicians, and masks on a scale far beyond what had been possible in Scotland. Her role as mother, diplomat, and cultural arbiter would intensify as England looked to her for example, spectacle, and guidance. James's accession did not merely alter Anne's title, it reshaped her life and legacy. From Scottish queen to queen of a united kingdom, Anne stepped into a world of greater prestige, scrutiny, and potential power, one she would navigate with intelligence, style, and determination.
The journey south from Scotland to England in 1603 was one of the most consequential and symbolic voyages of Anne of Denmark's life. Following the death of Elizabeth I, James VI's accession as James I of England required a carefully orchestrated royal progress, and Anne traveled alongside her husband, stepping into a kingdom unfamiliar, immense, and fraught with political expectations. Anne's entourage included ladies-in-waiting, servants, and advisers, each tasked with upholding her dignity and projecting the image of a queen accustomed to ceremony and authority. Every town, castle, and city they passed through became a stage, with subjects and officials scrutinizing her appearance, manners, and comportment. Anne understood that the journey was not simply a relocation, it was a demonstration of her visibility, legitimacy, and status as queen. The progress was long, physically demanding, and politically delicate. Roads were rough, accommodations were modest in comparison to royal standards, and the English landscape, with its unfamiliar customs and officials, presented constant challenges. Anne's composure, however, never faltered. She maintained the poise expected of royalty, while carefully observing and responding to courtly behavior, gauging allegiances, and asserting subtle influence over her household. Beyond logistics, the journey carried immense symbolic weight. Anne's presence alongside James underscored the union of crowns, projecting continuity and legitimacy to a kingdom wary of Scottish rule. Her carefully curated attire, the arrangement of her household, and her ceremonial comportment all served as instruments of diplomacy, signaling sophistication, refinement, and authority. By the time the royal party reached London, Anne had already established herself as more than a consort in transit. The journey south was a demonstration of endurance, tact, and strategic visibility, laying the foundation for her role as Queen of England. It was a calculated passage, one that merged spectacle, diplomacy, and political acumen, setting the stage for Anne's influence in a court far larger and more complex than she had ever known. Anne of Denmark's coronation at Westminster Abbey in 1603 marked the culmination of her journey from Danish princess to Queen of England. The ceremony was a grand spectacle, meticulously planned to reflect the authority, wealth, and continuity of the Stuart monarchy. London itself seemed to hold its breath as the city prepared to witness the crowning of a foreign queen whose presence would redefine the court. Draped in robes of gold and crimson, Anne processed through the abbey with a retinue of ladies-in-waiting, courtiers, and dignitaries. Every detail, from the embroidery on her gown to the placement of her jeweled crown, was symbolic, designed to communicate legitimacy, refinement, and regal authority. The glittering orb and scepter she received were not merely ceremonial. They represented the immense responsibilities of queenship, the power she wielded over her household, and her influence in shaping culture and succession. The ceremony was conducted with careful attention to Protestant ritual, a delicate balancing act for Anne, whose Lutheran faith differed from the English Church of England. Her participation demonstrated both piety and political astuteness, signaling respect for local customs while asserting her presence as an intelligent and active monarch. Courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and spectators alike watched closely, aware that every gesture and word was laden with meaning. Anne's coronation was also a statement of visibility. Unlike Queen's consort, who remained in the shadows, she occupied the center of public life, asserting her role not only as James I's partner, but as a cultural and political figure in her own right. The celebration included music, pageantry, and ceremonial feasts, reinforcing her authority and showcasing the sophistication of the Stuart court. By the end of the day, Anne had secured her position in England's monarchy. Westminster had witnessed more than a coronation. It had observed a queen establishing her identity, asserting her presence, and laying the groundwork for a reign that would intertwine diplomacy, culture, and power. Anne of Denmark's arrival in England introduced her to a court that was both magnificent and treacherous. The transition from Scotland to England offered prestige and opportunity, but it also brought renewed tensions, old rivalries, and cultural misunderstandings. The English court, long shaped by Elizabeth I's personal style of rule, was unaccustomed to a queen who asserted herself openly, and Anne's presence quickly highlighted differences in custom, expectation, and authority. From the outset, Anne faced skepticism. Many English courtiers viewed her as an outsider, a Danish princess whose influence might challenge established hierarchies. Her household, filled with trusted Danish attendants, fueled resentment among English nobles eager to maintain their own power and proximity to the king. Even small gestures, her choice of attire, her manner of speech, or the composition of her entourage were scrutinized and sometimes criticized, interpreted as signals of ambition or cultural arrogance. Tensions also arose in Anne's relationship with James I. Though united by marriage, the king and queen had long-standing differences in temperament, interests, and political priorities. James often prioritized diplomacy, governance, and patronage according to his own strategy, while Anne sought to assert her influence in culture, court ceremony, and the upbringing of their children. These differing approaches occasionally sparked disputes, creating moments of public and private friction that court observers eagerly noted. Anne responded to these challenges with a blend of tact and determination. She navigated English expectations while maintaining her own household and identity, asserting her authority subtly but unmistakably. Patronage of the arts, participation in masques, and careful cultivation of alliances allowed her to exercise power without direct confrontation. In this new court, Anne learned that queenship demanded resilience, patience, and strategic visibility. England offered greater prestige than Scotland, but the old tensions she had faced abroad now took on new forms, reminding her that influence required constant negotiation in a world where tradition, culture, and politics intersected. Despite the grandeur of coronation and royal ceremonies, Anne of Denmark's marriage to James I remained emotionally distant. From the outset, their union was shaped more by political necessity than personal affection. James, pragmatic and reserved, approached marriage as a matter of dynastic strategy, while Anne, intelligent and independent, sought partnership, influence, and a measure of personal respect within the relationship.
The emotional gap between them soon became apparent. Anne's early years in England highlighted the strains of a cold marriage. James was preoccupied with governance, foreign diplomacy, and financial concerns, leaving Anne to navigate court life largely on her own. She had hoped for intimacy and shared decision-making, yet found herself sidelined in matters of state, often relegated to ceremonial appearances and courtly duties. This emotional distance was compounded by the pressures of producing heirs and maintaining royal dignity under constant public scrutiny. The Queen's attempts to assert influence through patronage of the arts, management of her household, and involvement in her children's upbringing were often met with subtle resistance or indifference from James. Their disagreements were rarely explosive, but the lack of warmth and connection created a persistent undercurrent of tension. Courtiers and diplomats noted the formality of their interactions, describing a marriage of appearances rather than genuine companionship. Anne's response was measured. She cultivated her own networks of influence, asserting authority through cultural patronage, court masks, and careful diplomacy. Her independence became both a necessity and a strategy, allowing her to maintain dignity and power despite emotional neglect. The coldness of their marriage shaped Anne's queenship profoundly. It forced her to navigate the court with intelligence, patience, and subtlety, turning emotional distance into an arena for strategic action. In this challenging union, Anne learned that influence and survival required resilience, creativity, and an unwavering sense of self, even in the absence of marital warmth.
Anne of Denmark's role as mother became one of her most defining responsibilities, shaping not only her family but the future of the Stuart dynasty. Beyond ceremonial appearances and courtly influence, Anne understood that producing and nurturing heirs was central to her queenship, securing succession, stability, and the continuity of royal authority. Her first surviving son, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, became the focal point of her maternal ambition. Anne carefully oversaw his upbringing, ensuring that he received not only education and refinement, but also guidance in the virtues of leadership. She intervened in his tutors' appointments, monitored his studies, and maintained influence over his household. Every decision she made regarding her children was steeped in both love and strategy, for Anne knew that their futures would reflect on her own authority as queen. Anne's dedication extended beyond Henry. She bore several more children, each strengthening dynastic ties and securing alliances across Europe. Her attention to their health, education, and moral formation demonstrated a balance of maternal care and political foresight. In a court rife with intrigue and factionalism, Anne's role as mother gave her a sphere of authority that could not easily be challenged. Her motherhood was also deeply personal. Despite the pressures of statecraft and public expectation, Anne nurtured her children with affection, warmth, and attention, forging bonds that transcended political necessity. Yet motherhood was never entirely private. Every birth, every illness, and every public appearance of her children became a matter of courtly and national significance. Through her children, Anne of Denmark secured her legacy. She shaped the future rulers of Britain, cultivated loyalty, and ensured that the Stuart line would endure. In motherhood, she combined personal devotion, strategic intelligence, and queenship, demonstrating that the power of a queen extended as much through her family as through her courtly influence.
Anne of Denmark's role as mother extended far beyond nurturing. She took an active hand in shaping Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, into a Renaissance prince capable of ruling a complex kingdom. From his earliest years, Anne infused his education with intellectual rigor, cultural refinement, and an understanding of courtly and political life. She saw in her son not just an heir, but the embodiment of her legacy and the future stability of the Stuart dynasty.
Anne carefully selected tutors and advisors, ensuring that Henry's studies encompassed languages, history, philosophy, and the arts. Music, poetry, and literature were emphasized alongside martial skills, reflecting the Renaissance ideal of a well-rounded ruler. Anne encouraged critical thinking and exposed him to the cultural achievements of Europe, cultivating sophistication, taste, and judgment that would later distinguish him from his contemporaries. Her influence extended to courtly etiquette and diplomacy. Anne taught Henry the importance of appearance, ceremony, and tact, demonstrating that a prince's comportment could shape alliances, command loyalty, and project authority. She monitored his interactions with courtiers and foreign dignitaries, subtly guiding him to navigate the complexities of court intrigue with intelligence and charm. Anne also balanced discipline with affection, fostering a close personal bond that reinforced loyalty and trust. She understood that a confident, cultured, and emotionally grounded heir would reflect well on her queenship and strengthen her position at court. Through her guidance, Henry Frederick embodied the Renaissance ideal, a prince educated in both intellect and virtue, capable of leadership, diplomacy, and cultural patronage. Anne's meticulous attention to his upbringing ensured that her influence would extend beyond her own lifetime, shaping the monarchy and the realm through the education, character, and vision of her son. In raising a Renaissance prince, Anne of Denmark proved that queenship encompassed both maternal care and political foresight.
Anne of Denmark's determination to influence her children's upbringing extended to her youngest son, Prince Charles, later Charles I. Unlike Henry Frederick, whose education and household were carefully negotiated with James I, Charles became a focal point of tension between the king and queen. Anne sought to secure her maternal authority, while James, protective of his heirs and assertive of paternal prerogatives, resisted her influence. The conflict began early. Anne wanted Charles to be raised in a nurturing environment under her guidance, with attention to both education and personal character. James, however, insisted on controlling the prince's tutors, advisors, and daily routine, viewing his son's upbringing as a matter of statecraft and dynastic strategy. Every decision became a subtle battle of authority, with Anne advocating for her son's welfare while asserting her position as queen and mother. Courtiers quickly became entangled in the dispute. Some aligned with Anne, recognizing her intelligence and foresight, while others sided with James, fearing a foreign queen's influence over the heir could shift court politics. Anne's household maintained strict standards and discipline, reinforcing her authority and signaling that she would not relinquish her role in Charles's life. The negotiations, though mostly private, shaped the dynamics of the royal court and influenced perceptions of the Queen's independence. Despite these tensions, Anne did not openly confront James in ways that would provoke scandal. Instead, she used subtlety, diplomacy, and her household's loyalty to maintain influence. Her efforts ensured that Charles received attention, guidance, and maternal oversight, even under a king who sought control. The conflict over Prince Charles illustrated Anne's broader approach to queenship: resilience, strategic negotiation, and a willingness to challenge patriarchal authority when necessary. Through persistence and tact, she protected her children, reinforced her position at court, and demonstrated that a queen's influence could extend beyond ceremony into the very formation of future monarchs.
Anne of Denmark's life was marked not only by courtly triumphs, but also by personal tragedies, many of which tested her resilience and shaped her character. Throughout her marriage, she endured the sorrow of losing children to illness, a cruel reality in an era when infant mortality was high, even among royalty. Each loss carried not only emotional pain, but also political significance, threatening dynastic stability and amplifying the pressures of queenship. The birth of a child, once celebrated, could quickly turn to grief if illness struck. Anne experienced the fear and helplessness that countless mothers knew intimately, watching her children weakened by disease, consulting physicians and apothecaries, and enduring sleepless nights of worry. These moments were compounded by the scrutiny of the court, where every birth and death was a public matter, analyzed for political meaning and potential scandal. Loss was not limited to her children. Anne also faced periods of personal illness, weakened by childbirth and the demands of court life. Her health struggles underscored the physical and emotional toll of queenship, reminding her that her survival was as much a challenge as her authority. Each illness required careful management of her household and careful negotiation with the king, ensuring that her influence and position remained intact despite vulnerability. Anne's responses to illness and loss revealed her resilience and strength. She maintained composure in public while mourning privately, channeling grief into vigilance over her children's health, her household's welfare, and her own political position. These experiences deepened her understanding of mortality, loyalty, and the fragility of life, shaping a queen capable of endurance, empathy, and subtle authority. In facing illness and loss, Anne of Denmark demonstrated that queenship demanded more than ceremony. It required courage, emotional intelligence, and the capacity to navigate sorrow without sacrificing influence, dignity, or legacy.
The death of Prince Henry Frederick in 1612 was a devastating blow to Anne of Denmark, one that shook her personally and reverberated throughout the Stuart monarchy. Henry, her eldest surviving son and heir to the English and Scottish thrones, had been the focus of her careful guidance, education, and maternal devotion. His unexpected illness and death left Anne not only grieving as a mother, but facing the political and dynastic consequences of losing the prince she had nurtured into a promising young leader. Anne's grief was profound and public. Contemporary observers noted her sorrow during court ceremonies, her withdrawal from certain appearances, and her solemn participation in the mourning rituals. Yet, in addition to personal loss, the Queen understood the implications for the monarchy. Henry had been a unifying figure for both kingdoms, admired by the nobility and cultivated as a symbol of Stuart ambition and refinement. His death created uncertainty about succession and destabilized the courtly balance Anne had helped to maintain. The Queen's mourning was intertwined with duty. She oversaw the arrangements for Henry's funeral with meticulous care, ensuring that ceremonies reflected both royal dignity and the prince's accomplishments. Masques, music, and memorials were commissioned, blending personal grief with public expression, enforcing her role as a mother and a queen. Henry's death also intensified Anne's determination to protect and guide her remaining children, particularly Prince Charles. She became even more vigilant in shaping their education, character, and position within the court, aware that their survival and preparation were now paramount for the dynasty's continuity. The loss of Prince Henry revealed the emotional and political burdens of queenship. For Anne of Denmark, it was a moment of irreversible sorrow, yet it also underscored her resilience. Even in grief, she remained a figure of influence, strategy, and maternal authority, navigating the personal and political challenges that defined her life and legacy.
The death of Prince Henry left Anne of Denmark in a state of profound grief, casting a shadow over her life and her queenship. For months, the Queen's presence at court was subdued, her usual vibrancy replaced by somber attire and measured movements. Black became the color of her identity, not just a symbol of mourning, but a declaration of loss and dignity. Every gesture, every appearance carried the weight of sorrow, reminding the court and the kingdom that the heir she had so carefully nurtured was gone. Anne's mourning was deeply personal. Henry had been more than an heir. He was the embodiment of her hopes, ambitions, and maternal devotion. She had guided his education, overseen his tutors, and shaped his upbringing with care, seeking to prepare him for the immense responsibilities of monarchy. His death was not only a loss of a son, but a disruption of the plans she had cultivated for the future of the Stuart dynasty. Yet Anne's grief was inseparable from her public role. As queen, she had to navigate courtly expectations, ensuring that her mourning conveyed both respect for the deceased and the dignity of the crown. She orchestrated memorial ceremonies, commissioned music and poetry, and oversaw elaborate funerary rituals, transforming personal sorrow into a public testament of loyalty, honor, and cultural sophistication. The period of mourning also heightened Anne's vigilance over her remaining children, particularly Prince Charles. She became more protective, more assertive, and more politically engaged, ensuring that the lessons of loss would guide her efforts in securing the dynasty's continuity. In grief, Anne of Denmark revealed the duality of queenship, vulnerability intertwined with resilience. Her mourning was not a retreat, but a testament to her strength, a moment that blended personal loss with public responsibility, shaping her legacy as a mother, a queen, and a figure of enduring influence in a turbulent court.
As Anne of Denmark entered the later years of her life, her influence at court began to wane, a shift marked by both political changes and personal struggles. Once a dominant presence in cultural patronage, court masques, and the education of her children, Anne found her authority increasingly challenged by new factions, shifting alliances, and the king's priorities. James I, now settled in England, grew more focused on governance and foreign diplomacy, leaving less room for Anne to assert her views or direct courtly affairs. Her fading influence was also the result of growing distance from key figures who had supported her. Courtiers who had once aligned with her household gradually gravitated toward the king's inner circle, seeking favor and advancement. Anne's Danish entourage, loyal and protective, could only maintain a limited sphere of authority, leaving the Queen increasingly isolated in a court dominated by English power brokers. Despite the decline, Anne did not relinquish her presence entirely. She continued to oversee her household, patronize artists and musicians, and safeguard her children's welfare, particularly that of Prince Charles. Yet her suggestions in matters of state and court culture were often met with polite indifference or subtle dismissal, a reminder of the fragile nature of a queen's influence in a male-dominated hierarchy. Anne's waning power reflected both political realities and the personal toll of decades at court. Illness, grief over the loss of Prince Henry, and the challenges of navigating a foreign kingdom compounded her diminishing authority. In these later years, Anne of Denmark embodied the complexity of queenship, enduring public scrutiny, managing private sorrow, and sustaining dignity despite declining influence. Though her direct power may have faded, her legacy persisted through her children, her cultural contributions, and the enduring example of a queen who navigated the intricate and often unforgiving politics of Stuart monarchy with intelligence and resilience.
In the final years of Anne of Denmark's life, the rise of George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, cast a long and unsettling shadow over the Stuart court. Buckingham, a favorite of James I, wielded unprecedented influence, controlling access to the king and shaping policy in ways that left courtiers and the Queen watching with unease. For Anne, Buckingham represented both a political obstacle and a symbol of the shifting power dynamics that increasingly marginalized her role. Anne's relationship with James had long been complicated by distance and differing priorities, and Buckingham's presence intensified these tensions. The Duke's rapid ascent to favor, his intimate access to the king, and his political maneuvering created a court where Anne's advice and influence were often overlooked. Her household, once a hub of cultural and political activity, found itself increasingly excluded from decisions that affected the monarchy and her children. The Queen's frustration was compounded by Buckingham's interference in matters concerning her sons. Prince Charles, still under Anne's careful guidance, became a focal point of court intrigue, with Buckingham asserting influence over appointments and alliances. Anne had to navigate these challenges with discretion, balancing her maternal authority against the Duke's growing dominance while maintaining her dignity in public. Despite this overshadowing, Anne did not retreat entirely. She continued to patronize the arts, host cultural events, and manage her household with precision. Her letters reveal a keen awareness of Buckingham's influence and a strategic mind determined to protect her family's interests. The shadow of Buckingham highlighted the precarious nature of queenship in Stuart England. Anne's authority was limited not only by gender, but by the rise of favored courtiers who could command the king's attention. Yet even in this constrained position, Anne of Denmark demonstrated resilience, strategic thinking, and subtle influence, asserting her presence in a court increasingly dominated by ambition, favoritism, and intrigue. In the twilight of her life, Anne of Denmark returned to what had long been her most vibrant arena, the court masque. Though her political influence had waned and her health often faltered, the Queen continued to command attention through artistic spectacle, using performance as both personal expression and a subtle assertion of authority. These final masks reflected a life steeped in culture, diplomacy, and strategic visibility. Anne's last performances were marked by elegance, sophistication, and careful orchestration. She collaborated with composers, poets, and designers, ensuring that every element, from costume to choreography to music, conveyed her presence, taste, and intelligence. Even as her physical strength declined, she remained a compelling figure on the stage, demonstrating that queenship extended beyond ceremony or political negotiation. It could be performed, embodied, and immortalized through art. These final masks carried deeper significance. In an era when a queen's public role was scrutinized and often constrained, performance became a form of soft power. Anne's appearances conveyed dignity, command, and resilience, signaling to courtiers, foreign ambassadors, and her family that she remained a force to be reckoned with. Her engagement with the arts reminded the court of her cultural authority, even as her political voice was increasingly muted by the rise of figures like Buckingham. Yet behind the spectacle was personal reflection. The final performances were imbued with a sense of legacy as Anne considered her children, her household, and the impression she would leave on history. Each mask became a testament to her life, a celebration of creativity, intellect, and subtle influence. Through these final public appearances, Anne of Denmark reinforced a defining truth of her queenship.
Even as health and influence declined, artistry, poise, and strategic vision allowed her to command attention, project authority, and leave a lasting mark on the cultural life of the Stuart court. In the final years of her life, Anne of Denmark's health began to decline, casting a somber shadow over the vibrant courtly life she had long shaped. Years of childbirth, the rigors of travel between Scotland and England, and the relentless demands of queenship had taken a toll. Her once commanding presence was now tempered by fatigue, illness, and the physical consequences of decades spent navigating a demanding and often unforgiving court. The Queen's ailments, though private in their suffering, were never entirely removed from public awareness. Courtiers, diplomats, and physicians observed her condition closely, noting her reduced energy and frequent absences from ceremonial duties. Each day of illness reminded the court that even a queen's authority was vulnerable to the frailties of the human body. Anne's declining health affected not only her public role, but also her ability to oversee her household, manage patronage, and assert influence in political matters. Despite her physical limitations, Anne remained engaged in matters that mattered most to her. She continued to correspond with allies, advise her household, and maintain oversight of her children's education and upbringing. Even in sickness, she demonstrated resilience and strategic awareness, ensuring that her declining strength did not diminish her legacy or compromise the welfare of her family. Anne's decline was also a period of reflection. The Queen confronted the reality of mortality, considering the children she had raised, the cultural contributions she had fostered, and the political influence she had wielded. Her illness highlighted the precarious balance of queenship, the intersection of personal vulnerability and public responsibility. In these final years, Anne of Denmark embodied endurance. Her declining health did not erase her presence at court, her influence over culture, or her role as mother and queen. Even in frailty, she remained a figure of dignity, resilience, and subtle authority, leaving a lasting impression on the Stuart monarchy and the cultural life of her era.
In the final years of her life, Anne of Denmark experienced a quiet estrangement from James I, a distance that had been growing for decades. Their marriage, once bound by political necessity and dynastic ambition, had long been characterized by emotional distance, differing priorities, and occasional conflicts over children, court influence, and household authority. As Anne's health declined and the court shifted under new favorites like Buckingham, the rift between Queen and King became more apparent. The estrangement was subtle but palpable. James increasingly relied on advisers and courtiers for counsel while neglecting the perspectives and insights of his queen. Anne, aware of her diminishing political voice, retreated into her own household, cultural pursuits, and personal networks. Their interactions, once formal and strategic, became measured and polite, marked with routine rather than intimacy. Courtiers observed the growing reserve between them, noting the absence of warmth that had occasionally bridged earlier differences. Despite the emotional distance, Anne continued to assert herself where she could. She oversaw the education and protection of her children, particularly Prince Charles, maintaining influence over the family's future even as her personal connection with the king waned. Cultural patronage, masques, and correspondence with allies became avenues through which she exercised soft power, asserting presence without confrontation. The estrangement was a testament to the complex dynamics of Stuart marriage and queenship. Anne's life demonstrated that a queen's influence could coexist with personal alienation from the king. Her authority was not entirely dependent on emotional intimacy, but on intelligence, strategy,
and resilience. As Anne faced her final years, the estrangement underscored both the fragility and endurance of her queenship. Though physically present at court, her role increasingly became one of subtle influence and personal legacy rather than partnership with James, a reflection of a marriage shaped by duty, distance, and the realities of royal life.
Anne of Denmark's final chapter came in 1619, closing a story of resilience, influence, and complexity. For over 3 decades, she had navigated the courts of Scotland and England, balancing personal grief, dynastic responsibilities, and the challenges of queenship. Her death marked the end of an era for the Stuart monarchy, leaving a legacy felt in culture, family, and courtly life. Anne's final days were marked by illness and reflection. Those close to her noted a queen conscious of her mortality, yet determined to preserve dignity. She ensured that her household was orderly, her children attended to, and her affairs in order. Even in weakness, Anne's intelligence and composure remained evident. She considered not only her family's welfare, but also the impression she would leave on history. The court observed her passing with solemnity. Despite the estrangement with James I and the growing influence of favorites like Buckingham, Anne's death reminded the monarchy and courtiers of her enduring presence and authority. Funeral preparations were elaborate, reflecting both her status as queen and her contributions to court culture. Masks, music, and ceremonial displays honored her memory, blending personal loss with the public rituals of monarchy. Anne's children, particularly Prince Charles, felt the impact keenly. She had been a guiding force, shaping their education, moral character, and understanding of monarchy. Her absence left a void, both emotional and political, reinforcing the significance of a queen whose influence extended beyond ceremony into family, culture, and governance. The death of Anne of Denmark closed a life defined by courage, intelligence, and subtle power. She had survived personal grief, political challenges, and cultural scrutiny, leaving behind a legacy that extended through her children, her patronage of the arts, and the model of queenship she embodied. Even in death, Anne's life stood as a testament to resilience, sophistication, and the enduring influence of a queen who refused to be forgotten. The funeral of Anne of Denmark in 1619 was a ceremony of contrasts, grand in protocol but muted in spirit, reflecting both her status as queen and the complexities of her life at court. Though she had been a central figure in the Stuart monarchy, her estrangement from James I, coupled with shifting court dynamics and the dominance of favorites like Buckingham, cast a shadow over the rituals surrounding her death. Anne's passing demanded adherence to protocol. The ceremonial aspects of her funeral were meticulously observed. Her body was dressed in regal robes, her crown and scepter displayed as symbols of authority, and her household organized the procession with care. The court sought to honor her position while navigating the subtle political undercurrents that had defined her later years. Masks, music, and formal eulogies marked the occasion, offering both a tribute to her life and a public reinforcement of the monarchy's continuity. Yet, for all the ceremonial grandeur, the mood remained restrained. James I's personal grief was limited, reflecting the emotional distance that had characterized much of their marriage. Courtiers noted the quiet dignity of the event, but also its subdued atmosphere, an acknowledgment of the Queen's influence, yet tempered by the absence of warmth and affection that might have animated such a moment in an earlier era. Despite this muted tone, the funeral underscored Anne's lasting impact. Her patronage of the arts, her strategic guidance of her children, and her cultural contributions were remembered, even if subtly, in the pageantry and symbolism of the ceremony. Anne of Denmark's funeral was not merely the end of a life, but a reflection of a queenship marked by intelligence, resilience, and subtle authority. The muted celebration of her passing captured both the dignity and the bittersweet reality of a queen whose legacy, though quietly honored, would endure through culture, family, and history. The death of Anne of Denmark in 1619 revealed, once again, the emotional distance that had long defined her marriage to James I. Despite the Queen's decades of loyalty, cultural patronage, and maternal guidance, the King's response was marked by formality rather than heartfelt grief. James, ever pragmatic and politically minded, approached the Queen's death with the measured reserve that had characterized their relationship from the start. Courtiers and foreign diplomats observed James's reaction closely. While he attended the funeral ceremonies and ensured that protocol was followed, his demeanor betrayed little personal sorrow. Where one might expect visible mourning or public displays of affection, James offered speeches and gestures that adhered strictly to the duties of monarchy, maintaining appearances rather than expressing private loss. This cold response highlighted the persistent emotional gap between king and queen, a gap that had widened over years of political tension, estrangement, and the rise of favorites like Buckingham. Anne's death and James's subdued reaction also underscored the complex dynamics of power and dependency in the Stuart court. Though Anne had been a vital figure in shaping the monarchy's culture, guiding her children, and maintaining courtly order, her influence had always been circumscribed by her husband's authority. In death, the limits of her power were starkly visible. Even her passing could not compel the king to express what might have been genuine emotion. Yet Anne's legacy endured despite the coldness of James's response. Her children, the cultural institutions she supported, and the example of queenship she embodied remained intact. The king's formal reaction could not erase the decades of subtle authority, maternal guidance, and cultural impact that Anne had cultivated. Her death marked both the end of her personal story and a reminder that influence and dignity often outlive emotional recognition.
Anne of Denmark's legacy has long been overshadowed by history, her achievements and influence often underappreciated or misunderstood. Despite decades of queenship, cultural patronage, and maternal guidance, she is frequently remembered in passing, reduced to a footnote beside the towering figures of James I and her children. This muted remembrance belies the sophistication, resilience, and subtle power that defined her life. Contemporary accounts often focused on Anne's perceived extravagance, her foreign origin, or her involvement in court masques and fashion, framing these aspects as frivolous rather than recognizing them as instruments of influence. Critics of her era, particularly those aligned with puritanical or patriarchal perspectives, dismissed her cultural patronage and public performances as vanity, failing to grasp the strategic authority she wielded through spectacle, art, and ceremony. Even her maternal role, shaping heirs like Henry Frederick and Prince Charles, was occasionally overshadowed by political commentary or court gossip, minimizing the long-term impact of her guidance. Historical narratives have compounded this oversight. For centuries, chronicles of the Stuart court privileged kingship, diplomacy, and overt political power, while the nuanced ways in which queens like Anne navigated court culture, patronage, and family influence were marginalized. Modern historians have begun to re-examine her contributions, recognizing that Anne's authority was not always visible, but deeply consequential. She shaped the arts,
influenced courtly culture, and guided the formation of future monarchs. Anne of Denmark's story reminds us that queenship in early modern Europe often required subtlety, intelligence, and endurance. Though she has been remembered poorly in popular history, her life exemplifies how influence can operate quietly, shaping dynasties and culture without dominating headlines. In reassessing her legacy, Anne emerges not as a minor figure, but as a queen whose power and vision endured, even if recognition came belatedly. After Anne of Denmark's death in 1619, a quiet but persistent erasure of her memory began to shake tape, both at court and in historical records. Though she had been a central figure in the Stuart monarchy, her contributions to culture, courtly life, and the upbringing of future kings were increasingly minimized or forgotten. The political and social structures of the time favored male authority, and in the absence of her presence, narratives about the monarchy were written largely through the lens of James I and his male heirs. Courtly chroniclers and historians focused on the king's reign, the ambitions of favorites like Buckingham, and the drama surrounding succession, often portraying Anne as a peripheral figure. Her patronage of masks, music, and art, once a defining feature of Stuart culture, was frequently dismissed as frivolity or extravagance. Similarly, her role as mother and educator of Henry Frederick and Charles I, which had profound consequences for the future of the monarchy, was overshadowed by political events and military histories dominated by men. Even within the family, Anne's memory faded. James I's formal but emotionally distant response to her death set a tone for her legacy. Ceremonial acknowledgement rather than celebration of her achievements. Over time, courtiers who had once been loyal to her household either aligned with new power structures or receded from historical attention, leaving few first-hand accounts that captured the full scope of her influence. The erasure of Anne of Denmark illustrates a broader pattern in history, where queens' authority, cultural contributions, and maternal guidance were undervalued or marginalized in favor of the more visible exploits of kings. Yet traces of her legacy endure. The arts she nurtured, the dynastic stability she ensured through her children, and the model of queenship she embodied remain woven into the fabric of Stuart history, waiting to be rediscovered and recognized.
In recent decades, Anne of Denmark has begun to emerge from the shadows of history, her life and influence re-evaluated by modern historians. For centuries, she had been largely overlooked, remembered chiefly for her foreign origins, her extravagant wardrobe, or her involvement in court masques. Yet careful scholarship has begun to illuminate the complexity of her queenship, highlighting her intelligence, resilience, and cultural authority. Historians have examined her role as a patron of the arts, recognizing that Anne's support for masks, music, poetry, and theater helped shape the cultural life of the Stuart court. Rather than frivolity, these endeavors are now seen as instruments of soft power, allowing her to assert influence in a male-dominated environment. Her performances in courtly spectacles, once dismissed as vanity, are understood as deliberate displays of presence, taste, and strategic authority, reinforcing her role in shaping both court culture and political perception. Scholarship has also highlighted Anne's role as mother and political actor. Her careful guidance of Henry Frederick and Prince Charles, her oversight of education, and her management of their households reveal a queen deeply invested in the continuity and stability of the dynasty. By focusing on these aspects, historians recognize that Anne's influence extended far beyond ceremonial duties, shaping the next generation of Stuart rulers. Furthermore, modern research has uncovered the challenges Anne faced,
navigating estrangement from James I, managing foreign-born households, and maintaining authority amid courtly factions and religious tension. These studies present her as a resilient, strategic, and culturally sophisticated queen who exercised power in subtle yet meaningful ways. The rediscovery of Anne of Denmark reminds us that historical narratives can obscure as much as they reveal. Through renewed attention, Anne is increasingly recognized as a vital figure in early modern Europe, a queen whose intellect, artistry, and maternal guidance left a lasting imprint on the Stuart monarchy and the cultural history of England and Scotland. Anne of Denmark, often remembered through the lens of her role as Queen Consort, was a woman of depth, intelligence, and complexity, whose life extended far beyond ceremonial duties. Beneath the crown lay a personality shaped by foreign upbringing, cultural sophistication, and the relentless demands of monarchy. To understand Anne is to see the person behind the pageantry, a woman navigating love, loss, duty, and ambition in a world that scrutinized every gesture. Anne's life was marked by contrasts. She was a devoted mother, shaping the education and character of her children, yet she also sought personal agency in a court dominated by her husband, James I, and influential favorites like Buckingham. Her creativity and love of the arts allowed her to carve out a sphere of influence where politics and culture intersected. The masques she performed in, her carefully curated wardrobe, and her patronage of poets and musicians were not mere indulgences. They were expressions of intellect, strategy, and identity. Personal grief and loss shaped her inner world. The deaths of children, particularly Prince Henry, and the estrangement from her husband left emotional scars that were never fully visible in public life. Yet Anne managed to balance vulnerability with authority, projecting resilience while quietly negotiating her role as queen. Even in her declining years, illness could not diminish her presence at court, nor her influence over her household and children. Anne of Denmark reminds us that queenship was not just ceremonial. Behind the crown was a woman navigating the intersecting pressures of family, politics, and public perception. Her life combined intellect, creativity, and emotional depth, creating a legacy that extended through her children, her patronage, and her subtle yet enduring influence on the Stuart court. In understanding Anne, we recognize the human complexity behind the symbols of monarchy.
Anne of Denmark's story, long overshadowed by her husband and successors, has undergone a modern reassessment that seeks to rewrite her legacy. For centuries, history relegated her to a supporting role, an exotic consort, a patron of courtly spectacle, or a mother whose significance was measured only by the heirs she produced. Contemporary biases, gender norms, and political narratives minimized her influence, obscuring the subtle authority she wielded in culture, diplomacy, and family. Modern historians now recognize that Anne's contributions extended far beyond appearances. Her patronage of masques, music, poetry, and theater was a deliberate form of soft power, allowing her to assert her presence in a male-dominated court. These artistic endeavors communicated intelligence, taste, and authority, shaping the cultural identity of the Stuart monarchy. Rather than mere vanity, Anne's creativity became a tool of political expression, reinforcing her visibility and strategic influence. Rewriting her legacy also highlights her role as a mother and dynastic guardian. Anne carefully oversaw the education, upbringing, and guidance of her children, particularly Henry Frederick and Charles I, shaping not only their character but the future of the monarchy. Her maternal authority was an extension of her queenship, demonstrating that power often operated behind the scenes in ways subtle yet profound. This reevaluation challenges traditional narratives that prioritize male rulers and visible political acts, revealing a queen whose intelligence, resilience, and cultural leadership left lasting impact. By examining Anne's life through modern scholarship, we see her as a multidimensional figure, a woman navigating grief, political intrigue, and societal constraints while asserting influence through creativity, strategy, and maternal care. Rewriting Anne of Denmark's legacy restores her to the historical spotlight, presenting her not as a peripheral figure, but as a queen whose life and actions shaped the Stuart court, culture, and dynasty, ensuring that her influence endures beyond the shadows of history.
Anne of Denmark, the forgotten queen of James I, leaves behind a legacy that is both complex and inspiring. Her life was marked by contrasts: a Danish princess navigating the Scottish and English courts, a devoted mother balancing the upbringing of heirs with her own ambitions, and a queen whose influence extended through culture, diplomacy, and subtle power. Despite estrangement from James I and the challenges of court politics, Anne carved out a space for herself, asserting authority through art, patronage, and household management. She transformed the Stuart court into a hub of creativity, supporting masques, music, poetry, and theater, turning cultural performance into a tool of soft power. Her guidance of Prince Henry and Prince Charles ensured that her influence would shape the monarchy for generations. Anne's resilience in the face of personal loss, illness, and political marginalization demonstrates the quiet strength that defined her queenship. History may have overlooked her, but modern scholarship is bringing her story back to life, highlighting her intelligence, diplomacy, and cultural vision. Anne of Denmark reminds us that true influence does not always demand visibility. It can be exercised through strategy, creativity, and care for the next generation. Her life is a testament to endurance, subtlety, and grace in a world that often sought to limit female authority. By revisiting her story, we honor a queen whose contributions shaped the Stuart monarchy, arts, and the legacy of European queenship. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Anne of Denmark's life, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Your support helps bring more historical stories to life. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about what surprised you most about Anne's life and legacy.